I'm Charlie, and today we're going to look at what flight attendants notice about you in 3 seconds. Coming up first, we have look them in the eye. One Southwest Airlines flight attendant said something she always notices is if people make eye contact with her. She said she's not suspicious when people do, but she does investigate those who don't. Maybe they're scared of flying, or they're feeling nervous for some reason. Or maybe they're just shy or dealing with a personal issue. It's something people won't tell you outright, but a part of her job is making sure everyone on the plane is having a comfortable time. Also, if someone greets them in a really nice way with a smile and eye contact, they're more likely to be upgraded to first class. This does sometimes happen if there's any first class seats still available. Next up is fitness. You may think if you were going to see your doctor or trainer, they would make sure they know how fit you are. But flight attendants are also checking how fit you are when you get on an airplane. One flight attendant said he's always looking for able-bodied passengers who can assist with security problems. For example, if someone tries to hijack the plane, can you jump on them and make sure they stay down? He says he also looks for people who are willing and able to assist in an emergency evacuation. This will be someone traveling alone and in comfortable street clothing. They should also look like they're in above average physical shape. Or maybe you can tell they're an emergency service personnel. 99 times out of 100, no one's going to be called up to help. That's because, thankfully, airplane emergencies are not common. But in a time of crisis, attendants have to know who to turn to. That's why they'll discreetly examine your body when you step on a plane. They will then mentally label you as fit or unfit. Next up is under the weather. This is one critical check every flight attendant does on everyone on the plane. One TUI flight attendant says it's important to check everyone is fit to fly. That's because when the doors are shut and the plane's in the sky, it can be very hard to tackle a medical emergency. Flight attendants are trained in first aid, but not complex medical training. That's why there's the catchphrase, "Is there a doctor on board?" So that's why during boarding, many flight attendants check to make sure no one is sick. Also, airports often have lots of illness. That's because people are coming from all over the world. In a time right now when coronavirus has 80,000 victims, this is crucial. Recently, many planes with coronavirus victims have been put into quarantine, and no flight attendant wants that. Next up is nervous. Another TUI flight attendant says she always checks if anyone is nervous before getting on the plane. Now, that's not necessarily because they're suspicious of you. Instead, it's because they want to make sure everyone is comfortable on the plane. They don't know if someone has a bad fear of flying, or maybe they're just not feeling good for some personal reason. They look out for passengers carrying a medical book, or maybe frantically looking around or nervously playing with a headphone cord. Any of these things may be a sign the person has a fear of flying. Perhaps they want to hijack the plane or do something terrible. That is one of the other reasons flight attendants check for any nervous flyers. Next up is contraband. Everyone knows airports have vigorous checks to make sure no one smuggles anything in. But did you know that TSA fails 95% of the time to stop people smuggling weapons, explosives, or illegal materials? This was found out thanks to an investigation by the DHS. This was found out by a Department of Homeland Security investigation. This means there's still a pretty high chance someone could take something they're not supposed to on a plane. For example, people are known to smuggle their beloved pets onto flights. Sometimes they also smuggle in other things they're not supposed to, for example, weapons or illegal substances. This can put the safety of the flight in jeopardy, and that's why flight attendants always make sure they know what you're taking onto the plane. They won't go through your bags, but if they suspect you, maybe they'll help you with your bags. Then as they do that, they could take a peek inside. They'll also check for lumps under your coat. Maybe under your jacket you're smuggling in money or illegal things. If they see something illegal, they'll call ground crew and you'll be taken off the plane and arrested. Next up is pregnant. Have you ever looked at a woman and thought, is she pregnant or just heavyset? Well, that's what a flight attendant does multiple times a day. Usually after a certain number of weeks, a pregnant woman is legally required to carry a note proving that she's fit to fly. Sometimes people actually do give birth on planes, and usually these births work out pretty fine. After all, flight attendants are trained as to how to help somebody give birth. Also, there's usually one medical professional amongst the many passengers on a plane, but it's safe not to take the risk and make sure you know who is pregnant and who is not. Next up is jewelry. We've already established that flight attendants check out your appearance very, very carefully. But did you know one of the first things air stewardesses notice is your jewelry? specifically hanging jewelry and clothing, which could be a safety concern. In the airport, they can also tell where most passengers are heading by the way they're dressed. When you step onto a plane, they'll see if your clothing is flammable. They'll also check if you have any earrings, which could tear a safety slide if you were to evacuate the plane. Coming up next is drunk. One thing many people do before flights is get hammered in an airport bar. One flight attendant said they're trained to make sure they can notice intoxicated or aggressive passengers. They're also trained in basic taekwondo techniques in case of any aggression in the sky. But stopping anyone who's too drunk to get on a plane is their main goal. That's why if you're acting disorderly or really drunk, they will ask you to step off the airplane. It's fine if you have a few beers before your flight and then fall asleep on the plane. But if you come on shouting, swearing and wanting to fight other passengers, that is going to be a big problem. Next up is talkative. This is a small thing, but flight attendants will really notice if you're chatty. One flight attendant for American Airlines says when she says hello to a passenger, if they respond back, she'll think, wow, that person's really nice. She will then make sure to help them with anything if they have the need for it. And if there's any spare places in first class, maybe they'll even bump them up. So when you get on a plane, it really does pay to be nice. Secrets flight attendants will never tell passengers. Coming up first, we have secret code. We've all been sitting on airplanes before and heard those chimes. You know, the ones that sound kind of like this. Some people believe this to be the jingle of the airline, but that's actually not the case. The chimes you hear during a flight are actually a secret code for the airline attendants. Flight crews use a system of chimes and bells to communicate across the cabin, all while keeping their communication secret, meaning the passengers don't know them. The chimes could be about things like remaining snacks. They could also be about turbulence detected on the flight path. And sometimes, the chimes could signal a cockpit emergency or a change of route. That's why these airplane chimes are so loud, to get every crew member to hear them. Now, these chimes vary from airline to airline, so I can't completely decode them for you. But one singular chime normally means something mundane. For example, the pilot may be saying to the flight attendants, do a seatbelt check, or check for the number of remaining snacks. If there's two dings, it could be something more dramatic, for example, turbulence. And one you may not have heard before would be 3 dings. 3 chimes in a row usually means some kind of emergency or a total change of flight route. Let's hope you never hear that final one. Next up is be last to board. We've all had the experience of seeing people rush onto airplanes as soon as you can board. Hey, you might have even done it too, I know I have, but according to any flight attendant, it's actually way better to be last to board. Well, the great thing about boarding last is you can pick from any remaining seats. Unlike other passengers, you don't need to follow a seating plan. So you and your fellow traveller can be sure to sit next to each other on any remaining seats. Seeing as the doors have now closed behind you, you know you're the last person to get on the airplane. And this means you won't be taking anyone else's seat, no matter where you sit. So next time you're boarding, don't rush onto the plane. Instead, take your time and board last. Next up is toilet door. Have you ever used the lavatory on an airplane? If you have, then sorry you had to go through that. But there's one secret about airplane toilets you likely did not know, and it's actually to do with the toilet door. If you think that locking the toilet door from the inside will make sure no one can come in, then you're mistaken. That's because airplane toilets can unlock from the outside. There's an external lock mechanism hidden beneath the no smoking sign on the door. Now, this may seem pretty creepy that any flight attendant could potentially open the door while you're using the lavatory, but this is actually done for safety reasons. For example, in case someone passes out in the toilet, or in case a plane hijacker locks themselves in the toilet. Next time you're on an airplane, flip up the no smoking sign on the door and you'll see how you can unlock it. Just don't actually use this to unlock it while someone's using it. That would not be nice. It turns out on an airplane, privacy is merely an illusion. Next up, we have dimming lights. Have you ever wondered what it means if an airplane suddenly dims its lights? Some people think that an airplane dimming its lights would mean it's time for them to sleep. But the aircraft crew really don't care whether you're asleep or not. The reason airline attendants dim the lights is to prepare your eyes for a potential evacuation. Most of the time when you're on an airplane, your eyes are adjusted to darkness. This means if something goes wrong during takeoff or landing, your eyes aren't prepared. That is unless the lights have been dimmed and your eyes have become acclimatized to the new light. Now, the lights being dimmed does not mean you're going to have an evacuation. But statistically, during takeoff and landing is when most emergencies and evacuations happen. So that's why during takeoff and landing the lights are dimmed. And if you see this happening mid-air during turbulence, you may have an emergency landing, so get ready. Coming up next is more food. So most people don't really like airline food. That is unless they're on a 5-star Casey Neistat style flight. But if you do want more airline food, you can actually ask for it. You likely haven't heard of this, and that's because the flight attendants don't want you to know. That's because it's more work for them to keep bringing you food. But you can ask for as much airline food as you want. The reason why is because aircraft food has a very short shelf life. It's delivered pre-made, meaning lots of it gets disposed of. Pretty much all excess food is immediately discarded after the flight. So that's why passengers can actually eat as much as they want. It's basically an all-you-can-eat buffet, so don't be afraid to ask a flight attendant for more food. Next up is they're as frustrated as you are. Have you ever been really annoyed because your flight's been delayed and taken it out on a flight attendant? Well, if that's the case, you should know that they're as frustrated as you are. And I'm not just saying that, I really mean it. You may assume flight attendants don't care whether a flight is on time or not because, hey, they're getting paid anyway, right? Well, that's actually not true. Flight attendants don't get paid until the airplane doors close. Most flight attendants earn an hourly wage and don't start getting paid until the doors are shut. Also, they stop getting paid after the doors are opened. So if you're annoyed you can't get off the plane when you land at your destination, believe me, they are too. All that time flight attendants spend getting the plane ready, boarding passengers, and doing safety checks is unpaid. This is not the case for all airlines. For example, some European airlines do use a salary system, but in many USA airlines, flight attendants are paid hourly. So if your plane is late or delayed, don't take it out on the flight attendants. They're not even getting paid to be there. Next up is soda can. Have you ever noticed that if you ask for a soda on an airplane, they pour it into a glass and give it to you? Most of the time, the glass is much smaller than the soda can, and they can usually get 2 drinks out of 1 soda can. But did you know that if you want, you can ask for the whole can of soda? The airline attendants are told to pour it into a cup. This is because it saves the airline money. But if you simply ask the flight attendant for the whole can, 9 times out of 10, they will give it to you. You're paying for the flight, so I think you deserve a full can of Coca-Cola. Coming up next is secret ashtrays. It's pretty common knowledge that since the 90s, smoking has been banned on airplanes. Many people think this is because of fire safety on board a plane, or maybe to make the experience nicer for flyers. But that's not the case. Actually, it's because airline fans got very dirty from all the cigarette smoke. This meant they had to replace them more often, costing them money, so they just banned smoking on airplanes. But if you accidentally do light up a cigarette, you can actually use the ashtrays. That's right, airplanes built today are still made with ashtrays. Go into the airplane toilet and you'll see it. The reason why airplanes still have ashtrays is in case anyone does smoke on an airplane, and it's better to put cigarettes out in an ashtray instead of putting them into a trash can. So if your brain's going on autopilot mode and you forget smoking is banned on airplanes, then simply use the toilet ashtray. Next up, we have bulkhead seats. When you get on an airplane, many people rush to take the bulkhead seats. But according to flight attendants, you should avoid these at all costs. The reason why is because passengers with babies usually take the bulkhead seats. That's because they're slightly bigger and safer to place a baby carrier on. But this also means if you sit on one of these seats next to a baby, you're gonna have to endure screaming for hours on end. It's every flyer's own personal hell to sit next to a baby. And this is yet another reason why you should board last, to make sure you're not sitting next to any babies on board. And on the subject of babies, finally on the list, we have baby delivery. Doctors usually advise women who are deep into their pregnancy not to fly. But sometimes babies come out early. And sometimes people simply ignore this advice and fly anyway. Well, flight attendants are pretty much the aviation version of a Swiss Army knife. The reason why I say this is because they're trained to do pretty much anything. Many people think of them as simply waitresses in the sky, but that is not the case. They're also taught how to put out fires. They can also diagnose conditions and broken limbs, stop nosebleeds, and even do CPR. And most unbelievably, deliver a baby. That's right, if your water breaks at 30,000 feet, have no fear. Flight attendants are actually trained in delivering babies. And every year, 16 babies are delivered on airplanes. I've even made an entire video called "What if you give birth on an airplane?" so check that out if you want more information. What happens after you flush on an airplane? One of the great mysteries of the world seems to be how airplane toilets work. Well, the system we use today was invented in the 1970s by a guy named James Kemper. Before then, passengers on planes would simply have to do their duty in a bucket. If there was any turbulence or the plane moved around too much, then things would get very messy and smelly. And they used to empty the buckets simply by chucking it out of the window. It would then land on someone or something below. World War II fighter pilots would also have to do their business in a bucket, and sometimes they would empty the bucket over their targets. Some would actually call that biological warfare. But today we have what's known as the Kemper vacuum system. This first appeared in 1982 on a Boeing plane. The system uses a blue liquid known as SkyChem. That's right, that blue liquid isn't chlorine or just coloring. Instead, it's a chemical specially developed for airplane toilets. The toilet also has a non-stick coating and a vacuum suction. Because of the loud noise when you flush an airplane toilet, many people think the waste is being sucked out of the plane. After all, if you opened a plane door mid-air, this would cause a similar noise. That's because the pressure of being so high up would cause a vacuum. Well, on airplane toilets, there is actually a pneumatic vacuum that's used. When you press the flush button, a valve opens at the bottom of the toilet bowl. A pneumatic vacuum then swirls all of the contents and puts it into a waste management system. This is basically a tank inside the plane that collects all of the waste in that blue liquid known as SkyChem. But one big myth everyone believes is that the captain of the plane can detach the toilet tank and send it into the ocean. This is actually a myth, and there's no button which allows the pilot to just empty out the waste. Just imagine if that button was accidentally pressed. It's not a good idea to have. But if that's the case, then what are all these reports about blue ice falling from above? Well, this is usually a leak of the sewage tank. That sewage then freezes mid-air as it's falling because it's so cold up in the sky. Then it can fall to the ground and hit someone or something. There have been actual cases of this happening that I'll talk about in a moment. But if the captain doesn't empty the waste, then how is it removed from the plane? Well, the passengers will actually never see this bit. At the end of the flight, after the passengers are off the plane, someone will attach a hose into the plane. This then vacuums out the waste management system into another tank on the back of a truck. Then, once the waste is on that truck, it's emptied out with the rest of the waste from the airport. And then it goes into the sewers just like any other toilet in a house. But on that note, has anyone ever been seriously injured by falling waste from an airplane? You may think this is a rare occurrence, but it's surprisingly common. In the past 10 years, 27 blue ice incidents have been reported. Some of these have smashed car windows, and some have even gone through people's roofs and destroyed their homes. Recently in Salt Lake City, one woman was actually hit by some frozen sewage. She thought it was a small blue bird at first, but after it hit her, she realized it was a large clump of airline waste. The reason why it's blue is because of the SkyChem they keep in the waste management tanks. It turned out it had leaked from the plane and hit this woman. Also, one girl's Sweet 16 party was rained on by plane waste. Yeah, not exactly the birthday wish you could have hoped for. One couple's expensive RV was also wrecked by a piece of falling waste. A woman in India was also badly injured after some airline waste the size of a football fell on her. And one day a couple having a nice evening on their patio in New York had waste all over them. They realized it was from an airplane going from JFK Airport. But all of these people could have actually cashed out if this happened to them. You can be compensated by the airline if this happens to you if you know the plane it came from. And some say they may compensate you up to $10,000 every time. Maybe I should stand under more flight paths. But there we have it, guys. That is what happens after you flush on an airplane, and why some people report seeing blue ice falling from planes. I have to be honest, I always thought the pilots simply dumped it in the ocean, and I had no idea the trucks at airports actually suck out all the waste from airplane codes pilots don't want you to know. Coming up first, we have 7500. This may seem like a string of random numbers, but if you ever hear this, then you're in trouble. One of the biggest issues during an in-flight emergency is a pilot not being able to communicate the emergency to other people on the plane. Of course I don't mean the passengers, but instead the crew, and more importantly air traffic control. Sometimes they haven't been able to do this and army jets have not been scrambled. The plane then has the emergency and it simply crashes to the ground. Well, one of the worst codes you could hear over the intercom is 7500. This means the plane has been hijacked. A lot of the time during plane hijackings, the passengers don't even know. That's because they may use a threat to try and keep all of the crew quiet. And sometimes hijackings can even come from a co-pilot or a crew member themselves. So if you ever hear 7500 on an intercom, then it's time to panic. Next up is Code Adam. In 1981, a boy named Adam Walsh was taken from a convenience store. Someone had sadly taken him from his mother and then took his life. The terrible crime inflicted on this 6-year-old boy shocked the entire country. But that's why we now have Code Adam on airplanes. Code Adam means that there's a missing child on the plane. Now, this could either mean that a child has been taken from a parent on the plane, or it means someone's taken a child and they're trying to get away with them on the plane. According to the Center for Missing Children, this happens quite a lot. So if you ever hear Code Adam on the plane, it means a child is being taken. Next up is 7600 or 7700. Depending on the pilot's training and their airline, they may use either of these two codes, but they mean the same thing. Hearing these codes means that there's a radio failure or a loss of communication. Pilots obviously can only see so much. A lot of the information that's required to fly a plane comes from air traffic control. And of course, their screens which show the radar of other planes in the sky are also crucial. But if you hear these codes, it means one or both of these communication channels is not working. And if you're wondering how pilots remember these codes, there's actually a rhyme. It goes 7-5 taken alive, 7-6 technical glitch, 7-7 going to heaven. Yeah, that is pretty scary and not what you want to hear on a flight. Next up is Jim Wilson. This may sound absolutely stunning, but sometimes people pass away on board a flight. Every year, about 50 people pass away mid-air. This can simply be from old age, or maybe a heart attack on board. Some people even pass away from peanut allergies from people bringing food onto the plane. But the secret code used by airline staff when a passenger's passed away is Jim Wilson. To avoid alarming other passengers, they'll simply say there's a Jim Wilson on board. This may also refer to a body in the cargo. That's right, along with your suitcases, there may be a few bodies in the cargo. Think about it, if somebody passes away on vacation, then they need to be taken back to their home turf. And there's no special planes that do this. In fact, commercial planes do it every single flight. It's said that on about 10% of all flights, there's a body being transported below. And that body is often referred to as Jim Wilson. Next up is Code Bravo. Code Bravo is another very scary code you do not want to hear. This is actually a code to distract passengers. The flight crew will use this phrase to distract any passengers from actual danger. That way the passengers are focused on something else and not the real danger. And thus the pilots and crew can take care of that without any interference. One big issue when there's a danger on board is passengers trying to be heroes and butting in and getting in the way. So to prevent this, Code Bravo is what's said. Next up is air pocket. If you hear on the intercom that we're approaching an air pocket, then hang on. Make sure your seatbelt is buckled and maybe pull out the vomit bag. That's because an air pocket means you're going to experience some extreme turbulence. Basically, an air pocket is a nicer way of referring to having a very bumpy ride. And they use this code because many passengers are scared of turbulence. Next up is blue juice. No, this isn't some kind of delicious secret cocktail only the pilots know about. In fact, blue juice refers to the toilet water on the plane. For example, if they say we have a problem with the blue juice, this means the toilet water's spilled out. Also, if you hear the phrase we're dumping the blue juice, it means they're letting the toilet go over the sea. This is actually how they empty airplane toilets a lot of the time. But according to airline attendants, the toilet water is the same water that you drink. I've covered this in many videos before, but that's the reason why no crew on a plane will ever drink water, tea, or coffee. Next up is crotch watch. Okay, that's kind of a crude code, but it's actually something only the crew knows about. If a pilot says this, it's basically asking the airline attendants to check everyone's wearing a seatbelt. It may not be eloquent, but it gets the point across to the crew that they need to check everyone is wearing a seatbelt. You may think that's kind of pointless because in a plane crash, a seatbelt may not help all that much. But it's a legal requirement for them to check that every passenger is buckled up before they take off. Next up, we have all cool. If you hear all cool, this means something may be very, very wrong. For example, a pilot may say, flight attendants, doors to arrival, cross-check, and all cool. According to one former pilot, this means that they want kind of a conference call for all the flight attendants. The pilots may want to tell them some new information which has just come up. Or maybe they want to gather all the flight attendants to tell them that an emergency landing will have to take place. Either way, when you hear all cool, it basically means all crew report to the cabin. Next up is last minute paperwork. If you hear this phrase, then get ready to make yourself comfortable. This code means that there's an issue with the plane before taking off. This is usually something major, like an issue with the plane's weight and balance. This means the plane may need to be adjusted and it will take a long time. Sometimes last minute paperwork can mean a 2 to 3 hour delay. This is because they may need to reconfigure the entire plane's hydraulics. But it's a good thing that the pilot spotted this, as if they didn't, the plane could fall out of the sky. Next up is holding pattern. If you hear holding pattern, then you'll be in the air, but it means you won't be landing anytime soon. A holding pattern is basically a number 8 shape that the plane will have to fly in. That's simply because there's delays on the airport's runway. There are too many planes on the runway thanks to delays or bad weather, so the plane can't land. So that's why the plane simply has to fly in the number 8 shape above the airport until it's able to land. So if you hear the code holding pattern, get comfortable, you're going to be in the air for a long time. And finally we have ground stop. If you hear the code ground stop, then get comfortable. This yet again means there's delays and you won't be taking off for a long time. This is normally because of traffic backlog. For example, if one plane gets delayed, all of the other planes get delayed after it. So when this happens, there can be a ground stop, meaning that lots of planes have stopped on the ground. So now you know all the pilot codes, from the scary to the funny to the just plain weird.